Let's talk John Mateer, because anybody who stayed up late and watched Washington State games last year loves this guy. And what does he bring, and how different can Oklahoma's offense be with him in charge?
I think the biggest thing, Andy, is one, he's very skillful. You know, the way he throws the ball is a little bit unique. He almost sidearms it, but he's got a good arm. He can run. I think that's one thing too. He's bigger than what I thought, especially his lower half. I mean, he's got some huge legs, which feels weird to say, but it's true. And I think that what they do offensively, Ben Arbuckle, he liked to run him a year ago. I think he ran for 800 yards and over 10 touchdowns a year ago on the ground. I think you're going to see some of that play out, but I think the biggest thing, and the thing that we've noticed just talking to him, is his confidence. And not that Jackson Arnold wasn't confident, but there was just a lot of unknown with him, even for himself. Like, he didn't really know what he was getting into in terms of the SEC, and not to say John does either. He hasn't played in the SEC, but you can just tell the way that Mateer handles himself, whether it's in a media setting, in practice, his comfortability with somebody like a Ben Arbuckle. He's played in his system now for 2 years. Like, he just looks way more confident out there than Jackson Arnold really ever did.
And I would say that it's somewhat similar to the way that Dylan Gabriel came in. And that first year for Dylan Gabriel was a tough adjustment of just being the quarterback at Oklahoma. It's going to be interesting to see how John Mateer kind of navigates that as we work our way through the summer. But yeah, like George said, I think the number one thing was just the way that he was able to present himself to the rest of his teammates. I think he, earned a little bit of a kinship, or whatever you want to call it, with some of the new guys, being himself a new guy in that locker room. And that was, I think, striking to me coming out of spring, was how, I think, comfortable he was in being able to be the guy that, basically spoke up and helped Ben Arbuckle kind of bridge this offensive terminology and everything that he brought in from Pullman into what the guys that were returning were doing with Oklahoma a year ago.
And I would just add on top of that, guys, it feels like, and I know you guys have talked about it on your show, but there's a lot of hype around him. It's gotten to a point where I'm like, are we hyping him up too much? Like, it's got like, I think they're going to be better at that position than they were a year ago. I think they're going to be better offensively. It's more of a question of how good can they be? How good can John Mateer be? Because there's talk about, oh, he's a Heisman favorite. He's going to be a top, 3 quarterback in the country. Like, all of these questions, it's like, okay, I think he's going to be good. I think that he could be, a top 5-ish quarterback in the SEC. Is he a Heisman contender? I don't know if I'm ready to go that
I think
far.
There's a lot of PTSD too from last year and going into the season, and the hype that was around Jackson Arnold as a former 5-star kid out of Denton that, took over, obviously didn't play well in the bowl game, but there were glimpses of, okay, this guy's going to be the dude for the next couple of years. And, the schedule, it's a terrible schedule just in terms of tough opponents, but I think around here we're kind of saying, like, by week 2, you should have an idea where this thing is headed when Michigan comes to town obviously it was going to be a big game in the world of college football in the second week of the year.
Yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun. Sharon Moore will still be coaching Michigan. We think the suspension starts the following week. So that's going to be very interesting.
You know what I think is interesting, Andy, and I want to hop in here, is that throughout the last 15 or so years, I feel like Oklahoma's identity, a lot of it in terms of just who they were as a program, was wrapped up with elite level quarterback play and high flying offense. And it almost felt like watching Oklahoma last year, as a result of all the injuries and the offensive line ineptitude as a result of injuries and just not being very deep there, that they just weren't Oklahoma, and I think that the part of the reason why John Mateer is getting all this hype, or seems to be so important, is because I feel like if he steps in and is a top 5 quarterback in the SEC, which I think is probably a virtual lock, that Oklahoma just gets back to being the team that we've watched year over year my entire life. And I think that, like, being who you are and getting back to that is an important thing for Brent Venables, because I'm not necessarily sure Oklahoma has been peak Oklahoma at any point during his tenure, because they haven't had that guy there. So it's not just how good is John Mateer. I also think, and tell me if you think I'm nuts, guys, you know better than me, but like, if Oklahoma could just look like Oklahoma again, that would be such a huge difference maker in terms of the trajectory of the program into the future.
If they could just look like half of what Oklahoma used to on offense, I think that it would be huge. And that's the thing. I mean, Britt still wants to build, and that's what's been so interesting the last 4 years. he's kind of flipped the program on its head. Defensively, he wants that to be kind of the the side of the ball that kind of dominates, right?
Sure.
Like, and we've seen that they were great defensively last year, a top 15 unit in almost every single category. If they can just get the offense to a top 25-ish area, they feel like they can win a lot of football games. The problem, though, in Brent Venables' tenure now, in 3 years in, there just hasn't been a ton of complementary football. And even in 2023, when they had a pretty good team and were, one win away really from playing in the Big 12 championship, playing Texas again, who they beat earlier in the year, and possibly going to the college football playoff, those losses that they had, they didn't play complementary football. And even, that offense under Jeff Lebby statistically did really well, but in big moments, other than the Texas game, couldn't come through. And that's the thing I think that you want to see from Oklahoma, is not so much, be this historic offense that you saw under Lincoln Riley, which was just fantastic, won them a ton of football games. They just want to play complementary football, which has just been an issue, I think, for Brent, during his 3 years now.
Searching.
Yeah, and you kind of want to go back to the Bob Stoops era, where you let's say you had Kevin Wilson running the offense, and then Stoops and Venables running the defense, and they were good at both. Like, it's possible to be good at both, and I think to win in the league they're in now, you have to be good at both. I mean, Georgia's best teams, good on both sides of the ball. Alabama's best teams, good on both sides of the ball. When LSU's good, they're great on both sides of the ball. Like, I think LSU's a good example of the last few years in the SEC. Like, you cannot be lopsided one way or the other. It doesn't. You don't get what you want. You still have to be good at both things to win in that league.
No doubt about it. And I think that, just specifically last year when you had all the injuries, you were already kind of playing with one arm tied behind your back. And then they turned the ball over at a historic level. It seemed almost every week you can pinpoint a game where it's like, how do you lose that game? And the Missouri game is the one example that it's still mind blowing to think that they were up 7 in a game with 2 minutes left with the football and lost by 7 in regulation. They should get an SB out of it, honestly.
Well, between Oklahoma and Auburn, I think there was a lot of just head scratching, including the Oklahoma Auburn game, like the whole game itself. So
it was perfect that the game ended like that. And speaking of Kevin Wilson, he's now back in Norman as an analyst on this team. And I don't know if it's going to mean a big change in what they're doing. I don't think it certainly will. He's going to let Ben Arbuckle run the offense, but it is going to help having somebody like that around.
Yeah, and I think that for Brent, when you look at his shortcomings as a coach, he's not been a great game manager. And I think adding somebody like Kevin Wilson, who, I don't know his history of being a game manager, but he has been a head coach before. Brent's calling the defense, like allowing somebody like a Kevin Wilson to come in and help a young coordinator in Ben Arbuckle. Kevin Wilson could be Ben Arbuckle's dad. Like, I think that is beneficial, having somebody on staff that, while Brent's helping coach the defense and the offense is on the field, understanding just, small things like clock management, I think is going to be a benefit for them this year.
I just want to see when Kevin Wilson goes up to Ben Arbuckle and is like, son, we were hanging 40 on Michigan at Northwestern when you were in preschool.
Yeah.
And it's true. But that's the sort of thing, like when you have the new and the older generation and they work together well, that's where the magic actually happens.
Yeah. And I think that for a lot of people, this season is going to be determined on what happens on the offensive side of the ball, because there is a belief that this defense is taking a step each of the first 3 years under Brent. And you do lose the Danny Stutzman, you do lose the Billy Bowman, but they feel like they've recruited well enough and they've been able to go out in the portal and make some key additions going into this season that there could be a chance this is probably maybe one of the better defenses Oklahoma's put out with Brent coming back.
And the defensive line is probably the best it's been in terms of depth and talent, really, is probably the best it's had in about a decade. And that's why there's so much optimism on that side of the ball.
Guys, let me just...
the Barry Switzer quote back from 2013 when he's like, you used to have Gerald McCoy squatting down there. Like, Barry's finally going to be happy with the D-line. I'm glad for that.
Absolutely. And I think that, like, there's a couple of those guys, and you had the David Stone situation that he enters the portal, that he returns, but interior wise and the defensive end wise, getting it, the retainment of an Mason Thomas was a massive deal. They need PJ Adebawore to take that next step that I think a lot of people have been expecting. And he's kind of that perfect example of guys that take that next step in the third year under Brent Venables, historically, wherever he's been, whether it would be Oklahoma the first time around or Clemson and then coming back, the light bulb just comes on for a lot of those guys. And even somebody like I think a Billy Bowman was talking about it a year ago going into the season, that was his third year. And all of a sudden things really started to come together for him.
So I really like talking big picture too here. Especially for people who are listening that aren't Oklahoma fans, but want to know. I want to know this from you. It's very bizarre to look at, but the Las Vegas win total for them is 6.5 this year. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's a really tough thing to look at if you're an Oklahoma fan who's used like 10 win seasons were bad back in the day. What constitutes success in your guys' mind? Like, is there a number you put on it? Is it a look? I put Brent Venables in my top 25 coaches in America when we ranked our coaches here a few months ago, and people went absolutely berserk. I actually think that he belongs on that list. What does he have to do this year from a win standpoint or a look standpoint to prove me right?
That's such a difficult question. And I feel like we've been battling with that all offseason, because you hit it on the head earlier, Ari, when you were talking about this team could be a lot better than it was a year ago and only win 7 games. And so I think that some of it has to do with who they beat, who they lose to, how they lose those games. I mean, the way they lost games last year, where it was, you get embarrassed in Dallas by Texas, that can't happen again this year, right? I know Texas is going to be really good, maybe the most talented team in the country. You can't get embarrassed at the Cotton Bowl again. You get blown out at home by, a South Carolina team that was good last year, but a team that Oklahoma fans felt like, you should be able to compete with. You lose just an absolute horrific game, maybe the worst loss I've seen in my lifetime, to Missouri on the road.
There were some dark conversations going from Columbia to Kansas City last year at 2 a.m.
And then you finish the season in Baton Rouge and you just get blown out by an LSU team that I think is going to be really good this year. So I think a lot of it has to do with, if you can get to 8 wins, that would be great. I think that's a good season for Oklahoma. I think there's a lot of expectations here that OU should get to about 9 and maybe be in the playoff conversation. I think that would be a stellar season with this schedule. But for me, Ari, it's so much about what does it look like? Like if you go 7-5 and you just lose some really close games, maybe you lose a close one to Texas, you lose, on the road to Alabama or Tennessee in some close games, or maybe a last second field goal, but you're in it, you're scoring points or whatever, and they just come up with some lucky plays and you just can't win it. That's going to happen in this league. But there was too many times last year where OU just got embarrassed and they just looked like a dysfunctional football team. That cannot happen again this year.
I would also
9-3 is playoffs. If they make 9-3, I think they'll make the playoff.
Yeah, I think so. And with this schedule, if they could go 9-3, it almost feels like you'd be going 11-1 to a certain extent, in stealing a couple games that you're probably going to be an underdog in going into them. It's almost like, will people be talking about Oklahoma in a positive light by the end of November? If that's the case, that means it's somewhat of a successful season.
Yeah, they were the other side of it in November last year.
Sure,
of the conference,
absolutely.
So they cannot be in that same category this year.
So you guys mentioned the offensive line, and I wrote about this last year. You guys talked about it extensively on your show and on your site. Have they fixed, because it feels like there were some original sins back in 2022, in those recruiting classes that now maybe they've had some time to make up. Some of those players that they've signed since then have had a chance to develop. Like, how much different is that group going to look?
It should look a lot different, I would imagine, just in terms of just having a functional offense that can run a play with the quarterback not being sacked 2 seconds after the ball is snapped. And you saw a lot of that a year ago. Obviously, I think when you talk about Bill Beatenbone, that's why it's been such a tough conversation to have, because nationally, he's obviously one of the best offensive line coaches in the country. But I think if you ask the Oklahoma fan or the fan that is posted on the Crimson Quarter on the message boards, there's a lot of people that the patience has kind of been growing thin. He won that back, I think, bringing in this offensive line group in the 2024 class, or 2025 class, just in the fact that there's probably, as a whole, the best group that he's ever brought in. Michael Fasusi, Ryan Foje kind of leading from the front, and they could end up starting. If they if you told me they ended up starting midway through the season, I don't think anybody would disagree. But they have also gone into the portal, brought in guys that should be able to add depth. And, I think if nothing else, one of the things that Brent had told you, George, down in Destin was Troy Everett. I think just his presence, he was injured at the beginning of the season, missed a lot of that first part of the season when things really started going down the wrong track. And just his presence, I think, as a leader in that group should help things and mold that to be a little bit better from the jump at the beginning of camp.
Yeah. And Andy, I would just go back to the kind of the stat I threw at you earlier. Going into the 2024 season, they only had 2 guys coming back on that offensive line that had made 8 career starts combined.
Oof.
And it was Troy Everett, Jacob Sexton. This year, coming into this season, they have 6 guys that have made a combined 46 starts and have played over 3,000 snaps. And now some people would be like, well, those guys are the ones that gave up the 50 sacks a year ago. And I get that. Not all of those
it's
guys.
It's not easy the first year when you're playing.
Right.
It's
but
not.
I do think, though, that experience is valuable. Those guys, and a lot of those guys were freshmen or redshirt freshmen last year, sophomores that had never really played college football before. You bring those guys back. They learn under Bill Bedenbaugh. We've seen it time and again. They get developed. They grow into good players. And last year, guys, they took 5 offensive linemen in the transfer portal, and all 5 guys were players that they expected to start for them the next year. And they did. All 5 ended up, I believe, starting at least 1 or 2 games out of the portal. This year, they take 3. Well, 2 of those 3 in Luke Baklenko and Jake Michaela are projects. They have, I think, 2 or 3 years left. And so they're guys that they don't anticipate. Maybe they end up winning a starting job at some point or they have to play. But Derek Simmons, the transfer from Western Carolina, is really the only one fighting for a true starting spot right now. Whereas last year, all 5 of those guys they brought in, and sure, you can add in the portal and in certain spots, and maybe they come out and they be good players. I think on the offensive line, that's extremely difficult to do. You have to have a strong recruiting class and develop those guys. They feel like with the experience returning, as well as the freshman class that Eddie mentioned, that their depth and talent is much improved from where it was a year ago.
Are their receivers good enough?
That is a big question, Ari. I think that what they decided to do in the portal was, because you guys know the receiver market in the portal is just insane. The price number for a lot of these guys is just way too high. And so Oklahoma decided to allocate their resources to going in guys from smaller schools, a Giovanni Gibson, who was just a stud at Arkansas Pine Bluff. And he looks the part. I mean, you see him out there, 6'2", 210 pounds. The guy looks like an SEC type receiver. Crushed in the spring, ends up breaking his leg like the last practice of spring. They still anticipate him being back by the beginning of the season. Jaden Gibson, who was injured all last year, they expect him to be back by the beginning of the season. So it's a big question mark. Deion Burks needs to be the guy.
Kind of feels like you got to transfer in Deion Burks.
Yes.
With the limited amount of time that Oklahoma fans saw him a year ago.
Yeah, and he was supposed to be the star last year. He ends up getting hurt. So if he can be healthy, they feel like they have a guy. And then I would even mention Elijah Thomas, local kid from Oklahoma, true freshman coming in. He's got good size, was extremely productive coming out of high school. They feel like he can play for them possibly as a true freshman. He's that good. So they've got a lot of bodies that they brought in. Isaiah Satania, I mentioned him earlier, transfer from Arkansas, who had, I think, around 500 yards receiving a year ago and several touchdowns for Arkansas. They think that he can play. So they have, a handful of guys that they're basically saying who's going to emerge, and they're hopeful that at least a few of them can.
And much like the offensive line, they had to play a lot of guys as freshmen, true freshmen a year ago. A Zion Kearney, for an example, that you hope that you look back and go, yeah, that sucked that you had to be thrown in there as a true freshman, but you did get experience, especially on the back end of the season against some pretty good opponents in the SEC, and you hope you grow from that. They have to develop them as well.